Hi, this is Tim of the 1916 Company. Welcome and thanks for logging on. If you love this watch, email us, Team Mosso at the1916company.com for purchase pricing and availability questions concerning this watch. Today, we're discussing a hardcore tool watch from a brand that I don't only love, but I have actually owned personally. Sinn of Frankfurt, Germany, a company known for making pilot's watches for decades, but also more broadly known for making very hardcore utilitarian tool watches for a variety of professions, including government services. And so this watch is part of what makes Sinn so special, because it's one of the few companies in what we describe as the luxury segment that still makes watches for government, especially government uniformed service use. So this watch was designed to be used by the German elite cadre whose logo and name appear on the dial. You're looking at the UX GSG9, technically the EZM 2B in Sinn speak. The original EZM 2 debuted in the mid-90s, and this actually has some upgrades from that. We'll talk about that later. But it was designed with GSG9 in mind. So the idea being that GSG9 is sort of a German equivalent of what U.S. Army Delta Force is in the United States. So hostage rescue, counterterrorism, very high-stakes stuff. If you need to combine basically what Force Recon or Navy SEALs do with a SWAT team element, that's GSG9. So this watch was designed for their use, and you're going to find out that it's exactly what the doctor ordered. Taking a quick look, it is made of submarine steel with a DLC-coated tegament bezel, 44 millimeters in diameter, maybe a little bit thinner than you'd expect, at 13.5 millimeters thick, 51 from lug to lug with a 22 millimeter spacing between the lugs. My wrist is 16 centimeters in circumference, and I think it's the thickness of this watch that really catches me off guard more than anything else. It's reasonably thin, and it probably will fit underneath dress cuffs. You can see down the barrel, the lugs are not over the edge of my wrist. My wrist is 16 centimeters circumference, and I think that on this strap, this is the smallest wrist that could wear the watch. On a more flexible strap, you could probably wear this watch on a wrist as small as 15 centimeters circumference, and here's why. The strap is silicone. Sinn uses silicone because it is softer, more pliant, and more comfortable than rubber. And when you are doing what these guys do, trust me, it's worth it. It's also something that's less likely to chafe in the presence of sea salt, sweat, or sand. So that's another reason why it's used. You can see that there is some contouring to give a little bit of definition to the material. Like the case and the dial, it's all matte and anti-glare. It conforms to the case, which is why I say on this strap, you need a slightly bigger wrist because you can't pull the strap straight down. The junction is robust, but there is a stiffness here. Now, jumping down, Sinn over-engineers everything, including straps, so there are metal inserts that take the place of a conventional spring bar. These give you more purchase, and you can see that the clasp right here, I've opened it up so you can get a better idea of how this works. You can see that there are slots into which those little bars insert, pull back, and lock. And then there is a clamp that snaps into place to keep it locked and prevent it from pulling out. Now, this is an uncut factory strap. We will cut this precisely to fit your wrist, so don't worry about that. You will be very pleased with the result. You can also see that this watch is in excellent condition, as there are still original shipping stickers on both sides of the clasp, which is media blasted steel, just like the watch. You can see it closes, and it has a twin trigger release, so it will not open until you press both of those triggers, and thus it will stay resolutely shut until you want it to open. Rolling back to the case, Sinn expects that you will still swap straps on your watches and that you may wish to do so fairly frequently. So they include strap tool holes in the lugs. You can see the whole case is media blasted. Not only is this an anti-glare treatment, but it is to your advantage as the owner, because if there are any marks on the case when it goes back to the factory for refinishing, they don't have to grind it down and level the case, removing metal to remove scratches. They can just blast it again, which surfaces the material but does not remove it. The case is simple too. You can see not too big. Lug-to-lug 51 for a 44 is not huge. They're tapered, they're integrated, they're simple. The crown media blast screw down, by the way, this watch 5,000 meters water resistant. Now, the crown does make this ambidextrous. That's important to note, but it's not really why it's there. So it's not going to dig your wrist, whether you're a lefty or righty, but then again, it's not really there to protect you in the course of day-to-day life. If you are holding the underside of a rifle and or a flashlight during an incursion, it's likely that your prone and pronated wrist is going to give a conventional crown and crown guard an opportunity to dig your wrist. So even if you're right-handed, you're going to wind up in a position where that crown is digging your wrist. So to avoid any kind of chafing or distraction in a tactical stance, that crown has been moved to a place where it cannot offend anyone. And keep in mind, these watches are used by GSG 9, so that's not a theory. That's a fact. The case is made of U-boat steel. U-boat steel is a little bit different than conventional watchmaking steels. Conventional watchmaking is like 316L on most brands, 904L at Rolex. 904L is great because it's highly resistant to corrosion, which this also is. But when you're talking about steels that are 175 to about 220 Vickers, you're at a disadvantage to this because U-boat steel is 350. That's how hard it is. More scratch resistant, more dent resistant. The other thing it has going for it is that it is the steel used to make German U-boats. And I don't mean that it's being salvaged from World War II wrecks on the seafloor. I mean, Germany still makes U-boats today. Its submarines are used by its own navy, but also exported to allies. Classes like the 212 are fairly popular, and they are built of this same steel. So the purpose here is to prevent the steel from rusting or corroding or discoloring. When it's exposed to seawater or body sweat or corrosive chemicals, you don't need to rinse it to avoid corrosion. It's already protected against that. You can also see on the case back that the watch is extraordinarily water resistant. Why 5,000? Well, not to preserve the function of your watch when you are personally at that depth. It's more a side effect of the way it's constructed. Incredibly strong and oil-filled. So there is a little note on the dial there, hydro. This is a technology that Sinn developed and probably made more famous on the Bell & Ross watches made by Sinn than on Sinn's own watches. But if you remember the Bell & Ross Hydro, you might remember that they had oil-filled dials, and that's what we have right here. Resence didn't create this idea. They made it luxurious, but Sinn created the idea. So that oil under the dial, or I should say under the crystal on top of the dial, is able to give as good as it gets. So the pressure pushes down, the oil pushes back. The case being stout, 5,000 meter water resistance. What else is going on here? Well, the idea is that because this is a perfectly flat sapphire, the oil and the sapphire, and for that matter, seawater, have just about the same index of refraction. So from any angle, with zero distortion, you can read the time, and that is the idea. And you'll also appreciate that this watch, which is a dive watch, has robust luminescence. You could see that even the seconds hand is fully lumed, and the whole hand, not just the tip. The bezel pearl is huge, and this is true dusk till dawn. So if you take this thing, air it out in the sun goes down, who knows how many hours later, depending on where you are, but even if you are in one of those northern locations with long nights, this will still be glowing just before sunrise. Also, it's important to have a loomed seconds hand on a dive watch because you need to know if you're diving at night or if you're in the depth that your backup dive timer is still working. The bezel. The bezel is tegmented steel. So the case is 350 Vickers, but the underlying bezel is about 1,200. Almost as hard as ceramic. It's a carbon diffusion process. Now, there's DLC over it. So we need to talk about some of the upgrades. The upgrades to this compared to the original EZM 2 of the 90s include the movement and the bezel. So the bezel is tegment, which was invented after the original EZM 2 debuted. This is the EZM 2B. Tegment is very hard to scratch and dent, but then this hard black DLC is over 2,000 Vickers, and it is only used by Sinn over a tegment base. Think of an egg. The shell's very hard, but the yolk is very soft. So when the egg gets hit by something pointy and it's a hard impact, the eggshell collapses on top of the yolk because the yolk gives way. Well, that's how DLC generally gets a bad name on most steels and titaniums. The DLC gets hit hard, the underlying metal gives way and dents, and then the DLC, which is hard but brittle, fractures. Well, if you were to make the inside of an egg as hard as a rock, then an impact on the shell would be a lot less likely to collapse it, and it works the same way with DLC. As long as the underlying metal isn't soft, and here it isn't, the DLC will not chip and fracture when impacted. What's important to mention is, though, this is an Einsatzzeitmesser, so an EZM, a mission timer. Most of those have unidirectional or bidirectional bezels, and I think the bidirectional is probably the best known. Take note, this is one of the less common unidirectional bezels, which means it's like a dive watch. You can shorten your dive, but not extend it accidentally. Also, unlike most of the mission timer bezels, this one works like a dive bezel where you count up to 60 rather than counting down. So just be cognizant of that. You'll also note that there are screws outboard, and these screws are part of what's known as captive bezel construction. Really only Sinn and Breitling make this type of bezel at scale, and the idea is that the bezel is held on by the screws, so if you want to remove it, you need to remove the screws first. A Rolex, an Omega, a Tag, most dive watches, you hit it hard against a sharp surface and it'll knock the bezel off. Because this bezel isn't snapped on, it can't be snapped off. Now, the dial. Very simple to read, no distortion, oil-filled, and there is a little bit of interaction between the dial and the movement. So this watch uses an ETA Thermoline 955.652, which ordinarily has a 15-year power reserve. Because it does create a little bit more drain on the stepper motor to have the hands in a bath of oil, the power reserve in practical terms is cut down to about half of that on these. So just keep that in mind. That's still an extraordinary power reserve. Most quartz watches are like 2 to 4 years. So let's say this is minimally 7. That's already ahead of the curve. The other thing you need to know is it does feature stop seconds and a quick set for the date. Plus, this is a 7-joule Swiss luxury quartz movement. It is not disposable. When this watch is serviced, the movement is serviced, adjusted, and returned to the case. There's a quartz trimmer for making adjustments as the quartz crystal drifts over time so that the movement can be used over years and decades and even handed down from generation to generation. And it is a thermocompensated super quartz, so it's accurate to about 10 seconds a year. A regular quartz is 15 seconds a month. And the thermocompensation is important because it prevents drift of the timing, gaining or losing in hot and cold temperatures. Both mechanical and quartz movements do have susceptibility to temperature, but with thermocompensation, as here, you don't have that concern. Another important fact is that this watch goes above and beyond, being temperature resistant as low as -20 Celsius and as high as 60 Celsius. So it's a very durable watch, and you could see why GSG 9 uses this timepiece. It's no nonsense. It is a great way for you to buy a fun watch without blowing your watch budget and keeping your grails and your goals in sight while buying something fun to tide you over. You could even consider this a daily driver, even a beater in the luxury class. You're not going down to G-Shock, you're not going down to Timex Ironman, you're still building a collection when you buy this. This will be part of your collection, not a disposable article, and you don't have to worry about it because it is so tough and it's not super expensive. So whether you're on your way to a goal or you're looking for a daily driver, this could be perfect. And if you are tactical forces, a match made in heaven. Reach out to Team Mosso at the1916company.com for purchase and pricing details. One more quick detail, because I wanted to focus on this specifically and it would slow down the video. This watch has a track and a slide. So if you want to adjust the depth of its anchoring inside the clasp and use it as an adjuster for size or an extension for a dive suit, you have the ability to do that. I just want to show you that the track that takes the pin gives you a range of adjustment approximately 1 centimeter, maybe even slightly more, 11, 12 millimeters in length. So you have a good deal of adjustability. It's not just there to anchor the strap. It is a micro adjust and a dive extension.